Welcome to Cambridge Forum, discussing America the Vulnerable, with attorney and former National Security Agency insider Joel Brenner. I'm Pat Zerke, director of the forum, and I will be your moderator. The level of internet crime is staggering, according to our speaker, and he's not just thinking of personal identity theft or Wikileaks. Instead, Brenner reports that the United States businesses and government agencies are under relentless cyber assaults 24 hours a day, and they are bleeding military secrets, commercial secrets, and technology. What exactly is a cyber threat? How did cyber threats come into being? What can we do as a government and in the private sector to defend against them? What can we not do? Do individual citizens have a role to play in promoting cybersecurity? These are some of the questions that Joel Brenner will address. Joel Brenner is the former senior counsel and a former inspector general at the National Security Agency. He also served as the National Counterintelligence Executive, coordinating counterintelligence activities in 17 federal agencies, including the FBI and the CIA. He currently practices law in Washington, D.C. with the firm Cooley LLP, considered the most cutting-edge technology-oriented firm in the country. Brenner admits that he can't tell us everything he learned about cyber-insecurity during his years in government service, but his new book, America the Vulnerable, does reveal in chilling detail how insecure we actually are, and this will be the topic of our discussion. Welcome to Cambridge Forum, Joel Brenner.
Thank you, Pat. It's wonderful to be back in New England fall weather. And I'm grateful to the hardy souls here who've braved an evening. It's not a fit night out for man or beast, and I appreciate your being here to talk to me about this subject tonight. I'm going to read you the very opening of my book, and I'll put that aside and talk to you about why I wrote it and things that I have seen and continue to see up through yesterday and today in my law practice as to what's going on in a realm that in many respects is nastier than we know. And then I'm going to give you a flavor of the kind of stories that I tell in this book. I'm going to read you about an incident that I think will get your attention as it did indeed get mine. Let me begin. How did the Chinese manage to remotely download up to 20 terabytes of information from the Defense Department, equal to about 20% of all the data in the Library of Congress? And why don't we know exactly what they took? How did Wikileaks get its hands on classified diplomatic cables, and why hasn't the government been able to shut it down? How did the specifications for the avionics and armor on the president's helicopter end up in Tehran? And what has that got to do with the theft of Supreme Court Justice Breyer's private data from his investment advisor? The answers to these questions reveal alarming threats to our personal, corporate, and national security that come from a new kind of espionage and from the sudden transparency that electronic connectivity has brought to all aspects of our lives: personal, work, governmental. Your difficulties with electronic privacy, the electronic theft of America's cutting-edge technology, and the government's loss of state secrets are a lot more alike than you know. Now, I wrote this book because I sat through countless meetings with generals and admirals and senior civilian leaders in government who, at the end of these meetings, would often wring their hands or pull their hair and say, the public just doesn't understand what's really going on out there. So I thought I would explain it. And I thought I would explain it coming as close to the line of what I can and can't say that anybody in the government or recently in the government has yet done. Another motivation of mine for writing this book is that I saw abroad in our country the notion that privacy's in the ditch and secrecy has gone through the roof. And it's incorrect. They're both in the ditch. And they're both in the ditch for the same set of technological and cultural reasons. We did indeed, during the Bush administration, grapple with a White House that was obsessed by secrecy, often in ways I thought, even as I was in government at that time, that were positively inimical to the kind of government we wanted and to the administration's own objectives. But things like the temporary tightening down of the interpretation of the Freedom of Information Act is a sideshow compared to the massive releases of public information about everything that the government does or that you and I do. The government, your employer, your university, and you and I all communicate on the same telecommunications background using the same commercial off-the-shelf software. And we all have the same cultural proclivities at work as we do in the office and at home. If at home you put a sticky on your machine with your password and let other people know what it is, you do the same thing at work. If you click on things at home that you don't know where they came from, often corrupting your own machine, you do it with your employer's machine too. And you do it with the government's machine. And that's indeed how the avionics of the president's helicopter ended up in Tehran. Because many employers, including in this case a government contractor working for the Defense Department, didn't understand that loading file sharing software like LimeWire, music sharing software, and movie sharing software actually allow everything on your system to get shared by anybody who comes in contact with your system. Now, most people don't know that. But that's why somebody who was working for the Defense Department as a contractor decided to bring in, because you wanted to listen to music, and that is how the Iranians got everything that was on that contractor system, including really detailed information about the president's helicopter. And that's also how Justice Breyer's personal information got stolen, along with every other investor in an investment firm in from an investment firm in Northern Virginia, because one of the partners in the firm didn't know that either. And as he lamented to the Washington Post after the FBI explained to him what he'd done, he said, "You know, I didn't even know what P2P software was yesterday. Today, I guess I do." And this is the kind of thing about the inherent nature of the tools we use to communicate that have brought us so much productivity and so much pleasure that have also created enormous vulnerabilities and transparency in our lives. And this is true both in our personal lives, where we are, as I say in my book, electronically naked, often not knowing it. And it's also true, you know, in our lives as we go to work. But this world of transparency is not one that's been thrust upon us, least of all by the government. It's one we've actually embraced. I mean, you go to the grocery store, you go to Stop and Shop, you want to save $1 on a bunch of grapes, you tell them a lot about your personal buying habits, don't you? I do. And you could pay more. You could pay $3 instead of $1.50 for that bunch of grapes, but none of us does. And when we go through the tunnel, nobody likes standing in waiting in line for the toll, so we zip through an easy pass, telling a contractor for the state exactly where and when we're traveling. You get on the T, you got a Charlie pass, you do the same thing. I use a credit card for all kinds of major purposes. Kids walking around Harvard Square buy a cup of coffee with a credit card. The level of detail that we voluntarily give up for convenience as we go about our lives leaves footprints not only of every place we've been and most of the things we've done, but also increasingly of where we are now and what we're doing now. Because the wonderful devices that we carry around, these things, these smartphones, are constantly, every few seconds, communicating back with a cell tower. And even if we don't have a sophisticated GPS device in our phone, they are triangulating between cell towers and can tell people, leave traces of where we are. And so we can find one another. We now find it hard to get away from these things. We walk out of here even on a rainy night, and what are people doing? They're looking at the gizmo in their hand. We love this connectivity. We've embraced this world. You, I, and most everyone else. So that unless you pay cash and relentlessly disconnect yourself, you and I and everyone are leaving traces of where we've been and what we've done and what we're doing all the time, almost second by second. Now, let me talk about espionage for a minute, because espionage, the world I've just described and that I lay out in great detail in my book is a world that creates manifold opportunities for both state-sponsored and private espionage, both of which are on an extraordinary upswing, and both of which are beginning to affect people's private lives and private companies in ways that didn't used to be the case. There have been two things. Espionage is very old. I mean, spying is very old, right? Joshua sent spies into the Promised Land, right? He sent spies into Canaan to find out what it was like. You read this in the Bible. And he wasn't the first. That's not new. But two things in the last just decade have really changed dramatically about espionage. One of them is that you can now steal vast amounts of information remotely without having a spy on the inside. Like the example of the terabytes bled out of the Pentagon that I began by talking about. If you can steal terabytes of information remotely from the comfort of your office in Shenzhen or Kiev or Moscow, maybe you don't need a spy. Or maybe the spy is no longer the minister's private secretary, maybe it's the head of your IT department, or somebody else who can simply bring in malware and insert it in a machine with a thumb drive. So this has really changed, the porous nature of the internet, and at every organizational as well as personal level has created huge opportunities for electronic spying. And the second thing that has really changed about espionage is that the targets have changed. It used to be, you read World War II spy novels and Cold War spy novels. The targets of espionage classically have been the Defense Department, the State Department, the White House. It's the military political complex of governments that have been the targets of espionage of other governments. We now see relentless targeting of private industry in the West and in the United States in particular. And this is significant to all of us because what is being targeted is the technology that creates wealth and jobs in this country. The United States is still, by far, the largest single repository on the planet of really valuable technical information, much of which is proprietary, often secret. The Chinese and the Russians really went to school on us starting around 1990. A couple of really big things happened. The first of them was the collapse of the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union did not collapse because it was defeated militarily by us. It collapsed because it bankrupted itself trying to compete with us. The Chinese saw that. The Russians saw it, understood it too. The second big thing that happened in 1991 was the first Gulf War. Everybody, military observers around the world, knew that the United States had a huge advantage over the Iraqis in terms of air war. Everybody expected the ground battle to be a much more even heavyweight fight. We destroyed the Iraqi army in 100 hours, and almost all that armor was Chinese. The Chinese were terrified by this. They realized that the future of warfare had really changed with a stroke, and that the idea of a popular army streaming across the Yalu River in ways that swamped MacArthur in the Korean War was finished. And if the Americans could do that to Saddam, why couldn't they do that also to the People's Liberation Army? So they really went to school on that war. They also understood that the magic that the American military worked in the Persian Gulf was highly dependent on a command and control system that was computerized, that could transmit information from stations as far away as Australia to battlefield commanders in moments. They said, war is never going to be the same again. They also realized that we had spent $60 billion on that campaign. And they scratched their heads and said, who else but the Americans could spend $60 billion on a military campaign halfway around the world? And that fact, combined with the fall of the Soviet Union, made them and everybody else realize you cannot compete with the United States of America militarily unless you can compete with the United States of America economically. That meant that what they needed to know from us, what they needed to have from us, was technology. And both of those countries have been technology poor. To this day, there's never been a commercial microchip manufactured in Russia. An astonishing fact about a country that in the 50s was able to launch the first artificial satellite in human history. They still have not been able to commercialize a computer chip. Consequently, the targets of their espionage has focused, haven't abandoned political military targets, but it's focused on Harvard University and Stanford University and General Motors Corporation and Ford. General Motors has really advanced hybrid and electric car technology. They're 15, 20 years ahead of the Chinese. The Chinese have been really working hard to steal it. Ford knows how to make better brakes than the Chinese do. The Chinese have tried to steal that. We wrapped that one up, but they've tried to steal that. The DuPont, Dow Chemical, all the big corporations have technologies which are being targeted both electronically and otherwise by the Chinese, the Russians, and the Iranians. And people say, well, okay, that's the shareholders of those corporations ought to be worried and they ought to be more careful. But it's more difficult than that, precisely because of the openness that allows our culture to generate this kind of technology. And it's not just the shareholders of these companies that need to be concerned about it, because when somebody steals your car and you go out to the driveway in the morning, you know it's gone. When somebody steals a trade secret from you or technology, you've still got it. And unless the FBI comes and knocks on your door and says, look, you've been cleaned out, which is not in most cases, you don't know until 3 or 5 or 10 years later when you and your partners and fellow investors are scratching your heads wondering why that market share never materialized, and somebody in Shenzhen or a city in Siberia is opening a factory and hiring workers, and you're closing one and laying people off. What's happening now is the slow hollowing out of the American technological base. It is being targeted systematically. And it's not just, as I'm saying, not just military technology. We have lost the quiet electric drive that allows our ships and submarines to operate more quietly than a Lexus sedan. I mean, this is a ship as long as a city block that operates more quietly than a Lexus sedan. The Chinese have that technology now. They didn't invent it. If you look at the latest generation of American destroyer next to the latest generation of Chinese destroyer, you can't tell them apart except the paint jobs. And the radars are also remarkably alike because they stole that as well. But it's not just that stuff. It's the stuff that is being invented in laboratories around the corner, at the other end of Massachusetts Avenue as well. It is in fact universities and companies that are being targeted. The day before, no, yesterday afternoon, I see this in my law practice now, I found myself explaining to an emerging American company, the leaders of an emerging American company, things that in 2002 I would have to explain to the leader of an office who was going around the world. And in my role as the Inspector General of NSA, I would brief people before they went out and talk about kinds of threats they would face. And I now have to explain to American businessmen and women that a foreign investor from, say, Russia, who's bringing much-needed capital to that startup company, happens to be, I will explain, also closely related to the intelligence apparatus in Russia, and that you got two baskets of technology, and you want to do a deal for basket A, and you're really pleased, and you're getting cash because everybody knows emerging companies are always cash-strapped, right? And I have to explain that unless you separate out your servers and preferably put this basket B into a different subsidiary, you're giving away basket B to these guys. And explaining to somebody what it's like to be dealing with private business people, what it's like to be dealing with a foreign intelligence agency is just staggering. People don't understand it, don't want to believe it, and think, well, you know, is Brenner a security kook? I'm not. This is an aspect of a changing world that I lay out. The same kind of transparency in our lives that we've both embraced and that makes us deeply uncomfortable as we look at our children, for example, handling these technologies and creating vulnerabilities for themselves, is also doing the same thing for companies that operate in the same way. Say 15, 20 years ago, if you were, pick a chemical company, you were in the chemicals business, and you wanted to know what your competitors were researching, it was very hard to find out. Nowadays, if you just get on LinkedIn and you know who the people are, and people are telling you what they're reading all the time. This is enormously valuable information to a competitor. It's part of the openness that makes us clever, productive, and interesting. And so the dilemma is, how does one begin to, both in terms of behavior and technology, come to grips with technologies that are wonderful and that have also sort of taken our clothes off in some respects. So this is a slow hollowing out that I describe in my book. And I also, I talk about cyber war a good bit, but I want to make it quite clear that although I believe I know we are under relentless attack, we're not at war right now. If we were at war, a lot of really nasty things would be happening. And I think the tendency to talk about this as war is unfortunate. Even though some good friends of mine who are quite well known do that. I think the public is tired of hearing this, that, or the other undesirable social condition being talked about as the object of a war against this, that, or the other thing. And we've now seen enough people coming back from real battlefields with heat blast and fragmentation without arms and legs, and we know what that's like. There is such a thing as cyber war, and I really talk about different kinds of it. in the book. But I also talk, the Chinese don't want to go to war with us anymore. We want to go to war with them. It would be a disaster for human society, a war between the United States and the Chinese. But there are vulnerabilities that we have that I do lay out in my book that will not lead to war, that will lead to significant strategic defeat for the United States. In the South China Sea, for example, a part of the world Americans don't know much about, but here. The navigation in the South China Sea is a strategic issue for the United States. If we were to lose the rights of passage through the South China Sea, it would add 1,000 miles to the voyage from the Persian Gulf around to Manila, say, 1,000 miles. And it would push out the Chinese defense perimeter 1,000 miles. It would really change geopolitics in an extraordinary way. And I lay out in some scenarios that I think are hair-raising, and I meant to be hair-raising, about how that actually might happen. I want to close before opening up to a conversation, which is what I really want to have with you tonight, a very short piece about what happens when operations as well as information get hooked up to IT systems, to information technology systems. Because one of the things that's happening is that the vulnerabilities in information security have also led to vulnerabilities in operational security, and I'm going to explain to you right now how that's come about. This is from the beginning of a chapter called Dancing in the Dark, which is about the electricity grid. On March 4, 2007, an electricity generator from the Alaska grid began to vibrate, slowly at first, then faster and faster, until the delicately balanced turbines in the massive generator rumbled, shook furiously, and blew apart. And then the generator just shut down, hissing and belching smoke from its burned-out coupling. Explosives didn't destroy this hulk of equipment, though you might have thought so from the look of it, nor was it employee sabotage. The saboteurs were outsiders, miles away, and their tools were a keyboard and a mouse. They evaded firewalls, took over the controls, and opened and closed breakers at will, all the while manipulating the operator's screen to make it appear that nothing untoward was happening. Fortunately, the generator had been removed from Alaska and carefully reconnected elsewhere so that blowing it up would not wreak havoc on the grid. It was a secret experiment carried out by clever researchers at the Idaho National Laboratory. They reportedly called their project Aurora, and they blew the turbines apart by hacking into the digital devices that regulated power on the grid. When they got into the system, they simply instructed it to make rapid changes in the electricity cycles that powered the equipment. Fast, slow, fast, slow. And then they just waited, just a second or two, for the whole massive generator to blow up. Neither the United States government nor private industry can defend the networks on which our economic and national security depend. This situation's getting worse, not better. The Aurora experiment demonstrated that a risk to information technology had become a risk to operational technology, but few companies in the power generation business were listening. And they still aren't listening. Let's have a conversation.
You're joining us at Cambridge Forum listening to Joel Brenner discussing his new book, America the Vulnerable. And as moderator, I get to ask the first question. What can we do? Do you have advice for improving this situation and making ourselves a little more secure?
Sure. There are the kinds of things that I divide the question, segment the answer to the question in three baskets: technology, management, and behavior. Most people deal with this on the behavior, we individuals at the behavioral level. And the bad news is that when you leave security to the users of any kinds of system, it's a lost business. Because whenever security butts heads with convenience, which it does all the time, convenience wins, hands down every time. And so in the long run, we need to engineer better security, and this has to be done both at the software application level and by moving more security into hardware. But if you use P2P software, and if you share your passwords with people, and if you take thumb drives that came from you don't know where and put them in your USB ports, and if you bank mobily, why then you're really asking for tremendous trouble. I got a bit of heat when I was still in the government when I compared electronically transmitted diseases to sexually transmitted diseases. But really, and then some fathers came up to me and said, "Thank you, you finally explained this in a way my 13-year-old can understand." When you take, and the cover of my book, which does not have has a USB drive on the cover, not by accident, because this is the vector by which disease is spread, but one of the principal vectors by which disease is spread. And we know that in the Stuxnet business. That's how the Iranian centrifuge system controls were penetrated. Because that was a supposedly air-gapped system. And I explain how you get into an air-gapped system in this book. Nobody had done that in public before. If you really want to find if you want to understand how the Russians did that to us in CENTCOM, my book lays it out for you. But I was trying to explain to people that when you take a USB drive, a thumb drive, and you stick it in your USB port and you don't know where it's been, you want to put that in there? Huh? Where was that last night, right? And we know that intelligence services have poisoned these things on purpose in order to spread, to spread malware that then lets them bleed information out that your system will then phone their home with information. And that is how malware and viruses are spread. So this really, it is the same. Remember when the AIDS virus became rampant and public health officials were trying to get people to understand that you're sleeping, you're exposing yourself to every disease that anybody you ever slept with was exposed to. The same thing is with these electronic devices. It's the same thing. People have to be a lot more careful. If you do those things and you bank mobily, you're nuts. And that's your fault. But there are aspects of this that really require, to move on to the technological aspect of it, we have taken a system that began to be invented in the 60s by some geniuses that evolved into the internet. And it was developed for a closed circle and trusted circle of university and government researchers to be able to collaborate with each other across the country. It was a brilliant thing. But if you talk to Vint Cerf and the other people who actually did this, they lament that they decided on purpose not to put any security, to build security into that system. No identity verification or anything. They regret that now. But that system was only supposed to be used by trusted researchers. Until 1992, it was against the law to use the internet for commercial purposes. That's amazing to reflect. And even as late as 2000, say a decade ago, the level of commercial activity on the internet was trivial. People were just starting to buy books on Amazon. That was about it. Now, you can buy a car. People do all manner of transactions. So we've taken this wonderful but limited, insecure, porous system, and we've turned it into the backbone of our commercial life, of our financial life, and of our military command and control systems, all of which are penetrated. Now, you and I can't do anything about that. That's, I think, in the long run, is going to have some re-engineering. Let me illustrate one of the aspects of that engineering in a non-technical way. When I was about 11, I used to go skating, and I grew up in the South, in Richmond, Virginia. In those days, there was no ice in the South, so you went skating, it was on roller skates. And I remember one Saturday, I'm over at this rink, And there's this big kid, that would have meant 17 or 18, and he had this gizmo that would hold up to the payphone, and it would make pinging sounds into the phone like he was dropping quarters in, you know? And the operator couldn't tell the difference between whether somebody's really dropping quarters and somebody who can make the sound into the receiver of a person dropping quarters. And so he would make long-distance phone calls. Well, this was the coolest thing I had ever seen. The reason that he was able to do that is because the telephone system at that time, the Bell system, put its payment protocols in the same channel as the data protocol, the voice. It wasn't until years later that they pulled them apart. Our internet still works like the phone company in this phone system did then in that way, that security, which is identity and all the information about who's calling you, who's communicating with you, the path that the communication is taken, is in the same channel as the information that you want to convey over that system. That needs to be pulled apart. That's going to take a while. But let me come to the third aspect. And this really affects businesses. I was at Stanford, when I was still in the government, addressing a group of entrepreneurs who were dying for me to tell them what was the black box the United States government wanted them to invent to make this terrible problem go away. And I had to tell them there is no black box that's going to make this go away. And that the management aspect of this is where many of our worst corporate problems occur. You can't control, an organization can't control its own security if it doesn't know who's on its system, if it doesn't know what's running on its system, like the P2P software I was talking about, and if it has no idea what traffic is moving through its system. An extraordinary number of companies, even otherwise technically sophisticated companies, do none of these things, and very, very few do all three of them. That's not a technological problem. Failing to employ available technology is not a technological problem. It's a management problem. And most of our companies in this country still have it.
A quick follow-up. Would you care to put a dollar sign on the costs of re-engineering and changing management policies and procedures? It sounds like an extraordinarily expensive prospect.
Yes. The first question is no. I couldn't responsibly put a dollar sign on it, or assign a figure, but it's a very big number. And it will require the cooperation of the federal government, but the federal government isn't going to do this inventing. One of the federal government's roles will be to require much higher levels of security in what it buys and to guarantee a market for the more expensive kinds of hardware and software that we'd like to see. At the company level, it's a large number, but not necessarily a killing number. But it's been very hard to monetize security. So when you go into the CEO or the chief financial officer and say, I'd like you to spend more money on security, the response you get is, I know what the return on investment is for that $1 million or however many $1 million it is, where it's deployed now. What's the return on investment going to be if I move it to where you tell me I need it in security? That's a very hard question to answer.
You're listening to Cambridge Forum with author Joel Brenner as we continue our discussion of America the Vulnerable, examining the threats of cybercrime, espionage, and warfare facing individuals, corporations, and governments in the new digital matrix bounding our 21st century world. At this point, we'll take questions from the audience, and you're already lining up at the microphone. Please ask a question, and one question per person until we've got through everybody who has a question.
Speaking of ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency, that was the government's development of the internet a number of years ago. I read in the New York Times science supplement a couple of weeks ago about an IARPA, which you've probably heard about, intelligence research projects. And it's supposed to develop a cloud in the sky of data that's available for scientific and social and research, modeling, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm wondering if you know about that. It's supposed to be a 3-year program funded to do that effort, and what the ethical and security and privacy considerations would be quite enormous, I would think. Could you tell us about what your opinions about that?
Yes. I know about IARPA, which is an attempt by the intelligence community to recreate the dynamism in the research area that the Defense Department has achieved with DARPA. And I read that piece in the Times too. But I was not in the government when that was done. And I have no inside information about that at all. In my view, the principal threats to privacy in this country do not come from the government. They come from the information we freely distribute in the corporate sector. Which is not to say that government's access to private information is not a serious issue, or that government surveillance is not a serious issue. And I'm happy to talk about surveillance in the way you've raised it, sir, although I don't want to confuse surveillance with security, and I think the persistent confusion of surveillance with security has led to the notion that security and privacy are inimical to one another. They are not. You cannot have privacy without security of communications. Security in communications is a bedrock without which we don't have privacy. Now, to come more directly to your question, when I was at NSA as the Inspector General, I made as certain as I could, and I think I succeeded in this, in seeing that there was no research being done on private data or data of United States persons unless they had consented to the use for that purpose. I think that's probably still the case. The broader question, though, is what sort of research the government should be doing on what I'll call big data. Data is an enormously powerful tool, predictive tool that it has big public health implications. I think that we're going to look back on attempts to control research and data like attempts by the medieval church to control scientific research. And if the questions that come up with big data, for example, have to do with cluster theory in mathematics. How can you get large quantities of data to tell you things that when you didn't even know what to ask it? This is scientific research. Now then, the application of that research has to be watched and monitored, has to be transparent to the public, and there have to be rules about it. But the idea that our government, unlike every other government on earth, shouldn't be engaged in and shouldn't sponsor that kind of research, I don't agree with that. I think we ought to be. If we don't, other people are. Data is a powerful tool, and those who refuse to do research in it and to use it will be losers in the 21st century. So I'm all for that research, and I'm also all for watching it carefully.
My name is Helene Thayer, and my colleagues and I have been concerned about elections for quite some time, the electronic voting and electronic counting. There's a lot of them have USB ports as part of their construction, and then, of course, there's various kinds of remote possibilities of interaction. And there's a potential for both domestic and even more concerning foreign intervention in this matter. So I was wondering whether this is an issue to which you've given any thought or research or have any specific knowledge about.
Yes, I agree with you. I appreciate that question. I'll call it a corollary of a bigger principle, which is that there's no electronic system that can't be penetrated and manipulated. Some are much harder to penetrate and manipulate than others. But I ought to preface this by saying I did not deal with this in the government. I have no experience with it in the government, and I only come to it as privately thinking about it. I don't think we are at a point where, I'm not aware that we're at a point where we have electronic voting machines that can't be hacked. I share your concern about that.
I forgot one thing I wanted to mention, that there is almost no jurisdiction in the entire country which has truly high-quality, meaningful audits of any kind that you would think of in a banking situation, or a very, rigorous kind of place. So that is one thing that's been proposed, but most people are not concerned enough to actually put that kind of legislation in place.
You mentioned a really important word that makes almost everybody's eyes glaze over, and that's audit. But I want to point out that you've mentioned, and I'm glad you did, because I had forgot to. The only way to know what's going on in an information system is to audit it. Now, one of the brilliant things about electronic systems is that audit functions and operational functions can be collapsed. If you don't want certain activities going on in a system, you don't have to audit it later to find out whether those things were going on. You can tune the system so that those things can't happen, or that if you want them to happen only conditionally, and this is true of a shipping and ordering system, it's true of a surveillance system or anything else. You can, if you want something to be only to occur when it has the approval of a certain level of supervisor, then you can fix it that way, and then you can create an auditable trail of whether the supervisors, the right person, really did check off on that function. This is very, very important. And I remember back in the 90s when I was doing work on market regulation on Wall Street, I had a client that was one of the early pioneers of what's called black box trading. Instead of having a specialist on the floor of an exchange matching buy and sell orders, they'd go into a computer and they'd be automatically matched. And there were certain great efficiencies to doing things in this way. And then I went into its back office and looked at how they were doing compliance. And there were guys with green eye shades and pencils and paper. And I realized that's because they cared a lot about execution, the quality of their execution. They didn't really care about their SEC compliance. They did what they had to do. And I remember telling General Hayden when I got to NSA that, look, I've seen that movie. I know how it comes out, and let's make sure it doesn't happen here. And so I actually began to impose audits on surveillance systems at NSA. I'm very proud of that. But that's not the norm. And companies that want to control their systems need to do that. And that also means looking at what's leaving your system. I mean, we don't know how to keep certain stuff out, how to be completely impenetrable, but when large amounts of data are leaving our system, we can know that, and we can stop that. Systems can be designed to do that. And thank you for that question.
My name is Ethan Scarl. There has been a history where catastrophes or severe dangers have been exploited in ways that people later come to regret under the term shock doctrine or disaster capitalism, where rules are changed or restrictions imposed that would not normally be imposed. And I do not wish to impugn any of the warnings which you're giving us. They sound perfectly valid. But I wonder, for example, one of the lesser types of security that has concerned some of us has been what goes by net neutrality, the security that we all will have equal and open access to the internet, that the corporations who run the portals don't make decisions as to who goes faster or cheaper. So my question is there a relation between security and, for example, net neutrality?
Let me try to pull apart a number of things you've rolled into one question. Undoubtedly, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, the old FUD factor, can lead countries, cultures, societies to take steps in the name of security they later regret. I'm trying to bring a level of open discussion to this question and not come to you with hair on fire. But the risks are actually very serious, in my view, and you can read the book and then tell me later whether you think I've exaggerated them or not. I don't think I have. I know I haven't. But, and I haven't proposed limitations on communications that I think are dangerous to civil liberties. I haven't proposed any limitations on communications. I do propose that we bring to this aspect of our lives the same accountability for our behavior that we expect in every other aspect of society. We want to be able to drive freely on the highway, but not in cars without brakes, and we don't expect the highway signs intentionally to mislead us. We want to be able to go into the common or the park and do what we want without being surveilled, as long as we leave other people alone. That's not how network communications work now, sir. In the name of privacy, for example, which is the value of being let alone, which, like you, I think, I value highly, we have people who want to be able to engage with others anonymously. That's not privacy. That's asserting the right to go into the park with a mask on and assail somebody else. So I'm suggesting we begin to think about ordered liberty in this area and figure out ways to make people accountable for what they do when they harm others. And that does mean, to some extent, less anonymity when you deal with it. I mean, nobody thought it was an assault on civil liberties to publish a phone book. And I don't think you would regard it as an assault on a civil liberty that when you look at the screen on your phone, which shows you who's calling you before you pick up the receiver, that is right almost all the time. And if it's blocked, you don't have to answer it if you don't want to. And the reason it's not right all the time now is that we're carrying telephone calls over the internet. But before that, it was right virtually all the time. That's not true when you get an email. It's really easy to spoof identities on the email. But you don't think that having the display on your phone be accurate I doubt you regard that as an attack on somebody's privacy, right? It's who am I dealing with? I want to know who I'm dealing with. That's what I'm suggesting we need to move toward in internet communications. Now, I think you asked about, I've lost the second part of your question, which had to do with
net neutrality.
Net neutrality. Let me just leave you there. That's a big subject. Let me just leave you with one thought. If net neutrality means everybody has access on the same basis, that's one thing. If it means that we cannot filter communications that we know and have the ability to know are malicious, I'm not for it. We can do that. I think it's way beyond what I'm talking about when we get into how those things ought to be priced by the private sector. That's really a ball of wax. I'd love that conversation. I think that'll take us way astray tonight. If you let me, I'm going to dodge that.
Hi, Mr. Brenner. I'm Cressida Pollock. I had a question about, you talked a lot about the hollowing out of the technological advantage of America, and I wondered if you could comment on two things. First, whether there are any other countries who are doing better than America is on cybersecurity and protecting against that, and whether America still, as part of its technological advantage, has an advantage in pursuing these types of cyber attacks against other countries.
Those are both good questions, Cressida. The answer to the first question is no, I don't think, by and large, that there are any other countries doing a better job than we are, although there's some really interesting things going on in Australia right now. In my book, I propose that internet service providers, the AT&Ts and Verizons and so on, the British telecoms and Deutsche telecoms of the world, should play a much more robust role in filtering out botnets, these massive networks, criminal networks that they can identify. And they do identify them, and they don't take them down. They don't even let you know that your machine is part of one, which, I mean, could be the case. And I explain in the book how our privacy legislation is, I think, perverted to give them the cover not to do that. There are also commercial reasons they don't do it. They'd rather have you corrupted, but on their system, than have you clean and on somebody else's. And they all live in fear that if they told you your machine was zombieized and been a part of a criminal network, you'd blame them, which would be unfair, and you'd switch. So it hasn't happened. The Australians have moved to require their ISPs to do this. We know it works, and we're not doing it. So with that exception, that's I guess a big exception now, I don't think other countries are doing better than we are, no. Now, everybody likes to ask two questions at once. So let me answer your second question about, I can't discuss any specifics of offensive capabilities. You won't be surprised to know that. I will say that the offensive capabilities of the United States are really, really good. But we do not use our intelligence agencies in the service of private enterprise. Many of our adversaries have trouble believing this. The French do it, the Israelis do it, the Russians and the Chinese really do it, systematically. And there are 100 or so foreign intelligence services that target us. But there are two reasons we don't do it. The protection of private property rights and intellectual property is a bedrock principle not only of American but of Western governments. We have a lot to protect. To violate that principle and steal other people's intellectual property, to violate a strategic principle for tactical advantage is ipso facto foolish. We don't do it. But if you were going to be completely cynical about it and say, maybe we could get away with it, maybe we're that good, then you have to ask yourself, okay, what do we want to steal and from whom? What do you want to steal from the Chinese? Old generation tractor plants? I mean, the Chinese have an enormously robust economy. It is not yet an inventive economy. They correctly saw that was a big problem with the Japanese, and they see the Japanese as imitators and want to avoid that, but they have not yet been able to figure out how to do it. So that it's still the case that although this isn't right after World War II, when all the advanced technology in the world practically was in the United States, there's more advanced technology in the United States than in any other country on the planet. It's going to be many, many years before anything like that's true in China. So there isn't a hell of a lot to steal. So for both, when self-interest and principle lead you in the same direction, you have very powerful policy drivers. We don't do it. Okay.
Hi, I'm curious what you think is a bigger threat to security. Would it be the increasing sophistication of malware and programs used to steal information? Or would it be social engineering? And related, what do you think would have a bigger effect on security? Greater adaptation rates of existing security technologies, or educating people on social engineering strategies?
Let me explain to listeners who might not know what social engineering is. An attack, and I'll begin by telling a little sort of proverb in the techie business. The worst defects in any system are not in the silicon-based unit on the desk. They're in the carbon-based unit in the chair. And because you can spoof identity relatively easily on the internet, one of the principal attacks, really sophisticated attack vectors, is to do some research about who knows who in a government agency or a company, and then design a communication that looks like it comes from somebody that person knows, and it has a subject line that they've been talking about. That's a phishing, spelled with a PH, a phishing attack, and if it's designed to go after a particular person, it's a spear phishing attack, and that is a form of a socially engineered attack. That's what the questioner is asking about. We do not know, nobody knows how to defend against that attack now. Many of the things that we and our husbands, wives, children, and parents do foolishly on the net we can do something about. But we don't know how to do how to defend against social engineering attacks, and we will not know how to do that unless, to go back to the previous question, the first question from the floor had to do, I was saying, with authentication, with identity. Unless we can know for sure that an email, for instance, that purports to come from Joe Blow really is coming from Joe Blow, we're not going to know how to deal with socially engineered attacks. That's a very serious problem. And the only way that a company or an agency can really prevent the effects of a socially engineered attack is to prevent the exfiltration of data, because that's the sort of thing you can't keep out. You can't keep from getting in, so you have to look at how do you keep from getting out. Did you want to follow up or real quick? Did I get that? Okay. Next one then.
Hi, Mr. Brenner, Julie Lean. Thanks so much for your talk. I was hoping to ask you, tonight you've talked about a lot of the negative aspects and frankly very alarming and frightening aspects going on in our society today. And I was wondering if you see the evolution of openness in our society and if you can see any positive aspects. For example, the U.S. government using techniques and strategies to actually find out that other countries are, committing genocide or war or acts of aggression, things that might actually come out positively from this increased openness in our society today.
Yeah, that's a good question. This country did not become great by doing things in secret. Anyone who wants to solve the problems I've been talking about by locking us down will do much more harm than good. Transparency has led to many wonderful developments around the world, including the ones you mentioned, which is we can now find out about a lot of bad things that happen. It also leads to certain, trivialities in communication, but we now know about things that are going on inside of Burma or in parts of Africa and so on, and this is wonderful. But this is part of the global village that McLuhan prophesied in the 60s, to a degree even I think McLuhan, who I think was a prophet, couldn't have foreseen. But in a village, there are no curtains on the windows. Everybody knows what everybody else is doing and who they're doing it with or to. And you cannot have unlimited amounts of transparency and unlimited amounts of privacy. And the country needs to begin thinking hard about this because, by definition, if transparency is an absolute virtue in all circumstances, then discretion, reticence, modesty, tact, and privacy itself must be absolute vices. And I think the country hasn't sorted this out. in terms of when do we want this transparency and when not. Now, I don't think that question, I'll wax philosophical here. You're asking really about, I think, a fundamental issue of privacy and what it is. And let me say that I don't think that a discussion of privacy, like the one we've been having in this country lately, that focuses only on the control of data that people voluntarily relinquish, is going to get us very far. We also have to talk about what we don't want to put out there. To some degree, I think we're getting more used to having things be known about us and be less embarrassed by. Well, that's fine. That nobody feels that to be an assault on privacy. In other respects, we feel quite queasy about a lot of these things. But I don't want to suggest that transparency is not a virtue. I think it is a virtue in most cases, but not in all. And we're now dealing with with communications technology that we can't control very well, and so it doesn't allow us to modulate that, and which in 10 years or so has created a flood of data that we have, in which we have not found our footing. We're floating around in it. That flood makes us real nervous, even though we've put a lot of it out. Not all of it, but we've voluntarily put a lot of it out there.
Hi, my question may relate to two people before me, the gentleman's question. It's about how we can change our own behavior as individuals versus database security. So Apple Corporation has just released a software called iCloud. At a minimum, if a user wants the capability of sharing or syncing their own calendar, contacts, or music, even between their own devices, for example, portable devices and stationary devices, they are obliged to migrate all their information to the so-called cloud. So it's all going to be resident on the cloud. I feel this is a problem, and I hesitate to participate, even if it's to my own inconvenience. On the other hand, I feel that anytime you have a large cluster of information like that, any database, it's a beacon. So even if there weren't people fishing or looking for that information in the first place, like we already know there are, having this large repository that could have anything, you're not looking for weapons systems or somebody's patented engine, but you know that there's so much stuff on here, both the social interactions and the data, that it becomes worth being a target. So it's worth trying to rob the Federal Reserve, even though it's so hard to do, rather than robbing a small chain bank. And I want you to kind of talk about, is it our behavior that has to change, or do you have to secure and lock in what leaves a data system that the other guy was talking about?
Good to talk about the cloud for a minute. In the first place, there's no such thing as the cloud, and the questioner didn't assert there was one either. I'm not suggesting, but a lot of people do, so I want to touch on that. There's no such thing as the cloud. So-called clouds, there are lots of so-called clouds, and they all consist of groups of servers. I like to say that behind every cloud there's a clump, and the clump is a group of servers that is operated, on principles that are sometimes hard to figure out. Even you want to know where your data is, most of them don't want to tell you, and some of them probably don't even know. But the cloud, the possibility of using cloud services presents security opportunities and risks. The risks, as you say, on the Willie Sutton principle, the more money or data you put in one place, the more attractive it is to go there and rob it. That's where you want data, you go to where most of it is. But there are also much higher levels of security in cloud services, including encryption, than most people are using themselves. Most people don't patch, they don't keep their software up to date, they don't encrypt. So that I think in terms of the security of data from the point of view of either having it stolen or corrupted, most people are probably more secure in cloud services. Another aspect of security in the cloud, though, is availability. I mean, when you put all that stuff there, if something goes down, you're dead in the water. You don't have anything. And so there are issues of, I mean, I'm not using that yet, but I probably will, like everybody else, because I like to be able to get on. I already use an Apple, say, device that allows me to, so that what I'm carrying around with me has the same calendar as the one in my office and all that sort of thing. But I think one will give a lot of thought to backup systems when you're in the cloud. And there are different levels of cloud service. There's you could have them do your software for you. You can have them run whole operations for you. There'll be big variations. But I think in basic security, people are going to get better services than they get themselves. But the availability spooks me. Now, you said about putting everything on there. Maybe you're right. Maybe there's some stuff you just put on a piece of paper in the top drawer of your desk. I mean, that's another thing. But when it comes to your photographs, maybe your journals, or stuff like that, you have to decide where you're going to put it. Because this is not just Apple. Everybody's going to be doing this. All the providers, yeah.
Thanks very much for the talk. Just a quick question. You mentioned the challenge of going to a company and pitching new spending on cybersecurity to them. Is that something we ought to think of as a sort of public goods problem, that the danger to society is great, but the danger to any one company of being attacked is small? And so should we try to somehow make them take on that externality? Or is it a case where they just don't realize the cost to their company and we just need to be educating them about what the market really is?
I think whether it's a public goods question depends on the business. I'm troubled greatly now by the risk to our electricity grid. And I think that's rather like a public goods problem, where the incentives to the owners and operators of the grid to protect themselves are all wrong. In the name of marginal efficiencies in monitoring far-flung systems, they are increasingly hooking up industrial control systems to the public internet. And industrial control systems were not meant to be publicly accessed that way. I mean, some of these things you can now get on Bluetooth. These were supposed to be locked up and have access to them really severely limited. And there are some efficiencies that are gained by putting SCADA systems and industrial control systems on that. But I think it's rash to put such systems, to make them available, to make their controls available in that way. And I think that is like a public good, because we're talking about industrial controls which, if penetrated, could bring down whole regions of the country. I think the notion of the country going dark is science fiction. The country's too big and too robust for that. But we know that you could darken cities and regions, and it happened in San Diego very recently. San Diego went dark for several hours, and supposedly by accident. And when I say that, I don't mean to suggest that I have any reason to think otherwise, but I'm not altogether confident that we would be told the full truth about it. But we all know that if something can happen accidentally, it can be made to happen on purpose. And that is a public goods problem. And I think that's why in my book I propose that we have different regulations relating to the hooking up of electric grid control systems to the public internet. I don't think that about ordinary business. I think for the government to go in and tell the owners or managers of a company that they know their business better than the company does is rash, and I'm not for it. Companies are the needle's beginning to move a little bit. It's real easy, by the way, when you go into a company after they've had a bad breach. They're great clients because they're over a barrel. They do what you tell them, But to go into companies before they've had a breach, I'm in part of an investigation now of a company that is in a line of business that you would think, man, those guys really get it. They are really sophisticated. No information security department, no controls on hardware or software that are being run. pay no attention to the traffic that's going through their system. And when somebody leaves the company, their accesses are not shut off sometimes for weeks. Okay? This is not a technological problem. Right? But I wouldn't be in favor of mandating how that company behaves. You know, they may lose some valuable stuff, but that's for them to come to grips with.
Hi, Joel.
Sir.
Tom Gidowitz. You pretty much say that it's impossible to harden up our technological infrastructure enough to keep these things from happening. What kind of efforts are we making to sanction the perpetrators, especially, say, in the case of stolen electronic drives for submarines? You know, if you let these things continue, especially if they're sponsored by foreign governments, eventually you get to a very dangerous flashpoint where you don't want to get to. So I'm just, you know, how are we adapting both our foreign policy and our economic policies to really prevent things from going too far?
Great question. Criminal enforcement is an important tool, and it is being used robustly. But it is insufficient to deal with this problem. If you look at the number of prosecutions that we've had, and I discussed this in the book, in one recent year there have been 19 prosecutions, and there are hundreds and thousands of penetrations, criminal penetrations of networks. We can find, the FBI and the Secret Service are quite good at this, and when they realize that there's a large criminal network, they will target that network and the operators of that network. The really smart criminals are the ones who are satisfied to make more modest amounts of money, and they stay underneath of that level, and nobody goes after them. And the ability to engage in self-help. You know, okay, the guy stole from me, I'm going to go get it. I mean, you can't do that under federal law. Which leads to the international aspect of this problem. Most of the big criminal operations are not in the United States, even when they're operating here. They're in West Africa or certain parts of East and Central Europe, including Russia, and also in China. The Chinese come down very hard on internal crime, but they don't much care if their Chinese people are ripping people off outside of China. Developing international norms in this area is a major goal of the government now. And we're beginning to see some convergence with Russia in particular. The United States and our Western allies really want to attack the criminal problem. The Russians, the Chinese, the Zimbabweans, and the other bellwethers of human liberty really want to attack the information flow issue. So that they've developed a notion called information aggression, for example, and would treat as aggression under international law, which is under the laws of war, the law of armed conflict, would involve sending into another country information that its government thinks is destabilizing. You can understand why the Zimbabweans, the Chinese, and the Russians like that idea. So that's the fundamental problem with developing international norms now. But if you think about the decades it took to develop international norms in the control of nuclear weapons, we're not doing too badly. I think that's going to happen. The point is that you can't, no nation effectively can deal with the criminal problem without international assistance. These are multinational, transnational criminal organizations. We're pretty good. We've had some great successes against the big ones, but in terms of the overall volume of crime, not much. I want to finish with one comment, or do you want to?
I actually have one question.
Yeah.
You mentioned encryption in passing. Could you say a little bit more about that and how useful a tool is this in defense of our systems?
Well, the encryption available publicly now is very robust, and it's hard to break and expensive to break. Most people don't use it. Most companies don't use it. It slows things down a little bit. In my very first opening paragraph, I mentioned that the Chinese had taken 20 terabytes out of the Pentagon, and why don't we know exactly what they took? because we didn't think the information was worth encrypting on the way in. But the Chinese, on the way out, encrypted what they took. So we don't know exactly what they took. Okay? Now, encryption is not a perfect solution, but it's very definitely part of the solution. Of course, if you can steal a key, then you can unlock. It's not you're stealing information. It's like getting the skeleton key to the. You can unlock all the hotel room doors, you know, if you have the key. There are also problems with encryption in mobile communications. If the encryption of the sender and the encryption protocols of the receiver are different, then at one of the mobile towers, there is a fraction of a second when all that information's in the clear before it's re-encrypted, and somebody who penetrates that tower in what's called a man-in-the-middle attack can do it, can break it, or rather catch it when it's not broken. Also, a keylogger, which is one of the main forms of malware that people unintentionally download into their machines. That's to say, software that makes a record of every keystroke or mouse movement that you make. So if you've got one of those on your system and you're encrypting your data, it does you no good because the information's being stolen at the keystroke level before it gets into the system. So but encryption is a very important part of any information security practice.
Okay, I want to ask one last question that isn't technical or policy related, but you've posed a dilemma all through the evening between privacy and security, perhaps between transparency and security. Where does trust fit into this equation?
We are a very trusting culture, and that's true commercially as well as personally. It's very hard for Americans to deal with people who are not forthright. We don't know how to do that very well. We're not clever about that. Which also leads us, even in our notions of war and peace, as I discuss in the book, to think that, you know, war and peace is a kind of toggle switch. Either we're trying to kill people, or we're in this big kumbaya and everybody's being forthright with one another. I describe a world of struggle in which peace and struggle, trade and struggle coexist. But you cannot, at the personal level we've been talking about, you cannot have trust, you cannot have well-placed trust if you don't know who you're talking to. And that's why I think that a higher degree of authenticated identity on the internet is a good idea. There's still room for, you know, if you want, we ought to be able to browse things without having people look over our shoulders. We ought to, you can go to you want to go to a bad neighborhood at 3 o'clock in the morning for some, you know, encounter, any encounter you want. You ought to be able to do it, but it may be dangerous. And if you want to go to the equivalent of a bad neighborhood on the internet, you ought to be able to do it too. But if you come back with what I've called an electronically transmitted disease, then other people who are then dealing with you the next morning ought to know you've got it. And I think we have less trust without those things. I know I'm less trustful of communications as a result of what I think is a hard-headed assessment of the danger of communicating with people when you're not sure who you're communicating with.
Is that an optimistic end or not?
Well, I'll end this way. You know, I've described a world of some considerable dangers, both nationally and personally. And I've described a world in which there are no curtains on the windows. We are, to some significant degree, less private, less secret. You know, one of the advantages you were asking me earlier about that is hypocrisy is harder. Everybody should cheer about that, although hypocrisy is a socially useful convention occasionally too. We don't want to be too hard on modest degrees of minor vices. But we are in a world in which we're out there now. We're out there. People have to get used to the fact, fewer secrets. Secrets have half-lives. And those half-lives are shorter and shorter. Fewer things will be secret, and they will stay secret less long. And if we want to keep from being utterly victimized by that, we have to be a lot more careful.
Thank you. Thank you, Joel Brenner. You've been listening to a program of Cambridge Forum recorded in October 2011, co-sponsored by the First Parish in Cambridge Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For a CD of this forum entitled America the Vulnerable, or for additional information about our ongoing radio series and our Forum Network webcasts, visit us on the web at www.cambridgeforum.org. In Harvard Square, I'm Pat Zerke. Thanks for joining us.